Today, we discuss hyperempathy and autism, a condition where individuals feel others' emotions intensely, making it challenging to regulate their own feelings. We'll explore what hyperempathy looks like, its potential causes, its impact on daily life, and provide practical tips for managing it. Before we get started, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for reminders of upcoming streams. Let's get started. Hey, Embracers!
Welcome back.
I want to share a quick warning. I forgot to bring my water, so I don't know how my voice is gonna act this time around.
So if it sounds like you're in a desert, that would be the reason why.
If I start coughing up a lung.
Exactly.
So, we recently did an episode on empathy and how there's this misconception that autistics lack empathy and kind of the misunderstanding behind the concept of empathy with autism in mind. And it actually brought to mind the opposite of that, which is hyper empathy. And I feel like something that is less known or less discussed when it comes to autism. Have you heard about it before we brought it up for this episode, Matt?
I have not, but I guess it makes sense because like they're like the spectrum of just emotions in general. It makes sense like if you have someone who's super empathetic, then you would have like the or opposite like inverse to that. So I mean, it makes sense, but I've never actually heard the term before, so it's news to me.
So I'm going to start off defining it so that the listeners out there understand what it is because it is less common and less understood. And so hyper empathy is basically described as a condition where people, particularly those on the autism spectrum, experience others' emotions so intensely that it actually becomes difficult to regulate their own emotions. And I actually feel like this is something that I have experienced on occasion, like when we brought up in that one episode, I don't remember what episode, but we were talking about my experience going into that special needs school and how I hyper empathized with that kid who was in the wheelchair. And I felt that for days after that. I was like in tears. Even to this day, when I think about that memory and that moment, I just always get very emotional about it because I could so intensely relate to that child's experience.
So is it essentially, I mean, it sounds like it is kind of like because you're so empathetic into another individual's life, it has like carry over like effect into yours where it starts to impact like your life because you're feeling the emotions for them so much. So I mean it kind of seems very interesting. Like I'm trying to like picture that because I mean I don't think I have that. Like I mean I empathize with people, but the idea like that it would impact you so heavily that it would like impact your own just like daily life is kind of an interesting concept just to kind of picture how that would actually like play out.
It's like empathy at your own expense, essentially, is kind of what hyper empathy is.
So it's like kind of like you're like almost like sacrificing a bit of yourself for the other person, kind of like
At least
that
you're
give
like
or take.
your at least your well-being, your emotional or mental well-being is being sacrificed a little bit. So, for clarification, there's this misconception that autistic individuals lack empathy, which again we spoke about in one of our previous episodes. But there's been some new research that's coming out. It's still very exploratory. It's a new concept to look into, so there's not a lot of data backing it up yet. But I had read a study that said that up to even 78% of autistics in this one study were actually experiencing hyper empathy, which is a more heightened sense of
Hmm.
empathy that leads to an overwhelming emotional response. So it's like you don't really know what to do with yourself because you're experiencing that emotion so intensely. I actually know somebody who I will keep anonymous who actually experiences this, and to me, it clarifies so much because I had never really put 2 and 2 together, but this person very likely on the autism spectrum, and they basically cannot separate their own life and emotional experiences from that of the people that they care about. So if something bad happens in that person's life, it's just as equally devastating to them as it is that person, to the point where it can sink them into a depression or anxiety or things that you wouldn't think necessarily would happen to somebody who's simply empathizing with you. Like empathizing is like, okay, I'm sorry that happened to you. I feel bad. I genuinely want to be there for you, that sort of thing. But this is to a point where it's almost like it's happening to you.
Well, that's what I was gonna say, because I mean, given the situation, it is almost like that person is, like, losing sleep, or, like, that is, like, the, like, mental block that's, like, stuck in, like, their current, situation, so it's an obstacle for them, even though it is not their decision or their actions that need to actually take place in order to resolve it. So it is, I mean, yeah, I agree with you, that is a very challenging situation because you're more or less dependent on the other person's choices in order to get past your own obstacles, which, I mean, that's I mean, that could be a potentially a huge struggle, but it is interesting as far as, like, the 70% though. So this could essentially be in autism then, their version of empathy in kind of like the inverse, I guess, if
It
that
was
makes.
like 78%, which is a really high number, but again, this is an exploratory study, it was just one study, so I would not take that at face value, I would just assume it could be
It's just
a
interesting
glitch.
though. Right.
Yeah, yeah, but it was definitely interesting. So, like, these individuals essentially might feel emotional suffering at an intense level that a neurotypical person would not. So, for example, an autistic child might feel another person's distress for several days after being around them. It's like a cloud that kind of lingers and looms around them where it's kind of contagious. So if somebody is sad, they let's say their friend's puppy died and they're really sad, then maybe your kid has been hanging out with them and then all of a sudden when they're at home you notice that they're sad all the time. They're kind of acting like they're depressed and something's wrong, but nothing has happened in their own life. It's just that they've kind of absorbed the sadness from their friend. So that's something that we want to kind of keep in mind and keep an eye out for our girls because our girls are kind of different when it comes to empathy. Like one of them I feel like is very outwardly emotionally like strong and empathetic, and the other one is more internalized, so you don't really realize that she's experiencing deep empathy until you realize she's acting differently, but she doesn't really express it.
Yeah, it's true. But you know, an interesting thought I mean, thought of. I remember probably a couple years back on the podcast, we had discussed where sometimes, like, if they experience something very upsetting and it sends them to like a meltdown, that like if the meltdown is not resolved within like say like an hour later, they're still experiencing it at like the same like magnitude as if it just happened. I wonder if this kind of like spins off into kind of this hyper what is it called?
Hyper empathy.
Hyper
Yeah.
empathy.
Well, it kind of can because one of the things that you can keep an eye out to see if your child is experiencing hyper empathy is if they basically have a small emotional or physical reaction to either witnessing other people in like tough situations, even if it's in videos or in pictures, if they respond with like tears or anxiety or any sort of like physical discomfort. One of the things that comes up to mind for me is, do you remember our oldest when she was younger and we put on like a movie? There's some movies and every time that movie came on like a sad scene, she would start crying, like bawling. And to us, she was still too young to really understand what was going on, but it's like that scene triggered like a really deep emotional empathetic response, and then it
Right.
would take like an hour or so to like get her back to normal. I feel
Right.
like that's kind of an example of how you will see it with like really young kids.
So it seems like one is kind of like the internal focus, like kind of like when you hit like meltdowns or like the emotional experience, but then the hyper empathy kind of turns it the other way where it's someone else's life that they're kind of experiencing like the heavy emotions. I mean, for extended periods of time until it's kind of resolved.
Yeah, and the problem with that is these issues aren't always resolved. So, one of the downsides that can come with it is that having this over concern and hypersensitivity for other people's problems can lead to emotional burnout. And I've definitely seen that in the person that I know who experiences this is they go through a lot of burnout, and then it's like you can't even handle the small things because you're so burnt out with all these other people's problems that you can't even essentially deal with your own life's problems because you're spreading yourself thin across everybody else's stressors and problems. So that's one of the significant downsides to this.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the straw that breaks the camel's back. Kind of
Kind
like
of, yep.
everything is built up and then like anything else is kind of like too much and then kind of the the burnout there, but no,
Yeah.
definitely something that we'll have to, like, watch out for the girls. Like, I didn't even know, like, it was a thing, so now there's, like, another, like, fear to, like, add to our, like, list of, like, things to, like, keep an eye out, as they keep getting older.
I try not to
Mm.
focus on fear,
I
just being
know, right?
informed because being informed, the good thing about talking
Uh,
about these things is like once you learn about them, you can keep an eye out for them. So if they start to creep up on you, you can kind of nip it in the bud and protect against it. So,
oh,
yes.
I was gonna say, but it's also helpful because there is a name associated with it, and it's not just like, "Oh, there's this feeling that I have, I don't really know how to explain it, but when something bad is happening to someone else, I really feel it like, really heavy." Um, but it's nice that there's an actual term, so then you can, like, assign it, "Oh, this is what we're feeling, and this is how we kind of, identify when it's happening," and you can kind of, like, work with them, essentially. So I feel like by having a term to actually call it, I feel like you're kinda better off than, like, you would be essentially if you didn't know what to call it.
Yeah. So some of the red flags that you can keep an eye out for your child is if you're seeing that they are having any sort of social challenges where they're having difficulty maintaining those social relationships because of an emotional overload from absorbing those peers' emotions. If you see them, like, for example, hanging out with the kid who lost their puppy and then they came home and they're upset for several days, that's a red flag or indicator that they might be hyper empathetic. Another one you might notice, for example, is if there's like a school impact. You might notice that they're having anxiety or difficulty focusing in school environments which can be filled with a ton of different varieties of emotions. Like if a kid is going to school, they're around a lot of different peers who can all be feeling different emotions. They can all be having different days. So if your kids' emotions are kind of fluctuating with their peers, that's another indicator because they're kind of absorbing whatever's happening in the room with that social group or with those friends. So you can keep an eye on that. One of the ways that this tends to manifest with a kid in a classroom is like if they become really overwhelmed in a noisy classroom where you feel like the other children are voicing frustrations and then they just shut down as a response or they have a meltdown as a response, that can be an indicator because the emotional discussion of their peers is kind of what sent them into that meltdown, shutdown mode. So if you're paying attention to the context in which your kid is in and see if you can tie some sort of correlation between how they react and what their behavior is to what was being discussed, it might be an indicator that they are basically a hyper empathetic child.
So I wonder for that, like if our like oldest daughter starts to experience that, I wonder if we would work the same way we would do it essentially like to like prevent like a meltdown, like kind of like sometimes like she wants to be like hugged and just like deep breathing exercises or like trying to like talk through it, or I wonder how you would kind of like address that because it's a little bit different than like if it's like just them experiencing it because you can like kind of try and resolve some of those challenges, but if it's someone else's life that's being placed on them, that's a little bit trickier to try and like work through, I think.
Yeah. I think the trickiness is that the reason why they're reacting this way can kind of vary from kid to kid. This hypersensitivity of like hyper empathy is not specific to autistic kids. They just tend to be potentially more susceptible to it. But again, the research is still exploring this. And so, what the research tends to suggest is that there could be some underlying trauma that triggers it, specifically like in early childhood, and that will vary from kid to kid. Um, or it could also be that some autistic kids have a more heightened sensitivity to certain sensory stimuli, which can then extend to emotional stimuli. Just depending how that kid processes their sensory world, it could be connected to that. And because of that, there's so many different ways that this could be happening and therefore different ways that you can tackle it. But I think that the most important thing is really trying to find practical strategies that you can bring at home, starting with creating boundaries. Because I think that if your child is struggling with having other kids' emotions or other people's emotions leach into them, the most practical thing you can do is set a boundary around yourself as that child from those peers or people that are leaching into your emotions essentially.
I guess it makes sense. I mean, obviously, it would be easier to address at like an older age than like a younger child because like they're not as in tune with their emotions. They're not as in tune with their emotions, so they might struggle more because they don't really know how to deal with it. As where if you have an older child, like a teenager, you might be able to actually talk and work through some of these, in more of a, like, adult way, essentially.
Yeah, and I mean, you make a good point there about not being in tune with their emotions. That is another strategy that you can use is work on helping your child identify and understand those emotions. If you can get your child to understand that when they feel like a frog in their throat, that means like they might be starting to feel sad or they might feel like they're about to cry. If they're feeling pressure around their face or sinuses, it could be a sign that they're about to start shedding tears, things like that. If you can teach them what those physical features mean in terms of the emotional connection, what it connects to in their emotional state, then you can start to teach them kind of like preventative measures. So, for instance, if they are feeling their eyes kind of well up when they're in a group of specific friends, you can teach them, hey, when you're feeling this pressure on your face and you feel like your heart is starting to race, that's an indicator that maybe you should take a break from that group of friends and go do some quiet time, read a book, or do something until those feelings in your body go away. Then you can go back with that group of friends, and that would help prevent potentially a hyperempathy induced meltdown.
And I mean, that's I feel like equally true with, I mean, even neurotypical. I mean, I consider myself neurotypical, but I'm not.
You're not.
I know,
You're
but
allistic.
like, right there, that works. But like, if I'm in like a like conversation with people, and it's like a really like heavy conversation or something very impactful has happened, and I feel like okay, like I need to like leave this, or I'm gonna like bust out in like tears or crying or whatever. I'm able to kind of like excuse myself and then go off to the side and just kind of take a few deep breaths and try and like regulate and try and like get back to as close as like normal as I can get before returning to a conversation that is like very impactful. I mostly think of like individuals at like a like funeral or something where they all, I mean, obviously there's so much grief and just like pain at like a funeral. Sometimes you might have to step away to kind of like collect yourself and then try and like return because you can't really like just like run away from like this. I mean, you could run away, um but like you're kind of like stuck there essentially, as like some of these kids would be if they're in like a school environment. They're stuck around like their classmates where they can't just like leave the room. So they just have to kind of like collect themselves before trying to return to that group of friends or conversation that they were having.
Yeah, so it's important to teach those kids how to recognize their own emotional limits and learn to create that emotional space that they need when it's needed. Another thing that you can do is also help them acknowledge and validate those feelings, help them process the emotions they're going through, because especially for the younger kids, but even those that are older, I mean, everybody has different degrees of understanding and being in tune with their emotions. So, depending on how your child is on that scale of maturity with emotional understanding, you can work with them to really understand and grasp why they're feeling the way they do and process that feeling and see if you could get to the root cause of it. If you can help them discover that themselves rather than telling them, it's so much more effective. So instead of going to them and saying, "Oh, I see you feel sad because so and so's puppy passed away." It's more effective if you help them process that and you hold their hand through understanding and discovering that. So instead being like, "Oh, I see you're sad. What happened today that made you sad? Let's walk through the day and see if we can pinpoint where you started feeling sad, what happened when you started feeling that," and then guide them through it so that they can kind of process it more effectively.
So take them on the journey and let them get the realization for themselves about like their emotion.
Yeah, it's like that
Kind of
whole
like,
was it the teach the person to fish instead of giving them a fish thing?
yeah, that works.
There's some sort of metaphor.
Yeah, with fish and people, yeah, that
And
works.
food. But yeah, it's the same concept. It's better to teach them how to process it rather than tell them because then they can apply that to future situations. And especially with autism, where we're very literal thinkers, if you tell us what to do in that specific situation or tell us how we should think in that specific situation, we won't be able to apply it to other situations as effectively. So it's better to help your child understand the process of how you got from point A to B rather than just tell them, "Hey, you need to be at point B."
It's funny because, like, I was just thinking about, like, our own life. That also works in, like, marriage too, because, like, when you tell me, like, "Oh, like, Matt, if you eat this, like, you're gonna feel terrible later." And I'm like, "Hey, I'll be fine." Like, I still feel like I'm strong in my 20s and all this stuff. But then, like, I feel terrible and I'm like, "Man, that I don't feel good. And then I'll do it again and again and again. But then like if like down the road I'm like if someone says like, "Oh, why don't you try taking more vitamins?" And then I take the vitamins like consistently for like a week or whatever. And I'm like, "Wow, like I really feel like really great and all this." And then your wife happens to pop in and be like, "Oh yeah, kind of like almost like when I told you like not to do X, Y, and Z because you'll feel terrible." And then you kind of have the realization of like, "Oh yeah, I have to learn the journey for myself instead of just being told like what the end credits are essentially."
So, like how I told you, you probably should not buy over 2 pounds of raw cookie dough and eat it straight out of the tub?
Oh, but that's why they make it though. Oh.
That's for another day, though.
Oh my gosh.
So
All right.
so there's, like, so
Back
many
on
things.
track.
Yeah, there's so many things that you guys could do to really work on this. Another one that you can use is sensory tools. You can help your kid through deep breathing exercises to help self-regulate during those emotional moments, or help them with calming routines so that they can help themselves manage their own emotional overload. We are big on, like, co-regulation, so we try to help our kid by being actively involved in the process of regulating those emotions, with the goal that eventually you phase out that support and they can support themselves. But initially, we tend to recommend being there with them and helping them manage it one on one rather than just saying, here's the guide, do it yourself.
Right. I know we've always talked about like play therapy and like how that's been helpful as far as like behaviorally. But I guess like you wouldn't necessarily even need potentially play therapy if you're able to kind of like work with your kids and like play with them or do like a like an activity where you're able to talk freely but like your child is still like focused on the activity where they're able to talk but not like fully be engaged in the conversation. So it's almost like you're able to kind of like pull information out of them while they're enjoying another activity. So you can kind of gauge what the situation is through play versus like just like a sit down type of like question answer on how your child is doing.
Yeah. I feel like in my experience, the best thing that has worked too is to simply hear your child out. And it's something that we've also kind of learned through play therapy where it doesn't have to be this upfront confrontation. You don't need to basically say, I see that you're sad. Talk to me. Tell me what is happening. Because not many autistic individuals respond well to that, especially when a lot of us have difficulty explaining how we feel or even understanding how we feel. So that might not be a fruitful exercise. Definitely will not help with kids who are nonverbal. So I think a better approach is kind of getting next to them instead of in front of them, which is already a less confrontational stance. So get next to them, partner level with them, and start some sort of activity together. Like if your kid is really into puzzles and you see that they're overwhelmed or upset, be like, hey, you want to do a puzzle with me? Get next to them, start working on the puzzle. And as you're working on the puzzle, you can kind of weave in some sort of questions. If those questions are too on the nose, they might not respond. So you can be a little more sneaky in the way that you bring it up. This is something that we learned with play therapy too, is maybe bring it up through their special interests. Maybe bring it up with like, let's say you're doing a puzzle of Mario and our kid loves Mario. Oh, how do you think Mario's day went today? And things like that. How do you think Mario's feeling? And when you kind of weave it that way, some kids feel safer to explore their emotions or talk about how they're feeling than they would if you just point blank asked them how they were feeling.
And you raised a good point because I was just thinking, if you basically kind of just say like, "Oh, it looks like you're sad," if they're feeling frustrated, you've kind of already like assigned them an emotion that they might not be having. So rather than just kind of like just tossing out emotions of what they could possibly be feeling, if you're able to kind of like work for them to volunteer what they're actually feeling, if they're at the age where they're capable of expressing the emotion to you. So rather than you just kind of assuming like, oh, you're sad, you're depressed, what like whatever the emotion is, let them actually tell you using like their own like words or if they're capable of it, because then they feel more validated as far as like, no, I'm not sad, I'm frustrated, I'm irritated, I'm annoyed. Like let them use like the words to express like what they are, because then I feel like maybe at the end of the day they'll feel like they can get something off their chest because they feel like they've actually been able to share the emotion and kind of get through it versus like kind of like pieces of whatever that emotion is.
Yeah. And alternatively, one of the things that I have seen with hyperempathy is that with some kiddos, you might actually have an opposite effect if you are asking them to talk about it. Because of the hyper empathy, some kiddos might get more triggered talking about it, and it might bring on the waterworks again because they're reliving it, rethinking it, re-experiencing it again. So if you sense that your child is that type of person where talking about it makes it worse, you might just want to sit down and do the puzzle and not talk about it. Maybe the goal is to keep their mind off of whatever is upsetting them. Maybe refocus them and re-engage them in something that you know they will enjoy to help them keep their mind off of whatever it was that they were over empathizing with. So this is where you as the parent really have to do some deep digging on how your specific child reacts and behaves and what would work for them. Our kids are kind of opposite, so like what works for one wouldn't necessarily work for the other kid.
Oh, man, parenting these days.
But that's why we're here. Tips and
Yes.
guidance.
Oh, indeed.
But at
Mm.
the end of the day, we're basically, just another set of parents. Like we're not experts in any way. We just sharing our life experience and what's worked for us. But we just feel like the spirit of parenting autistic and neurodivergent kids is really kind of like trial and error with an open mind and just really being very engaged with your child. I think the worst thing you can do is disengage and assume things will work out on their own because that's not necessarily or even gonna often the case. So it's better if you are just really involved, and if it works, it works. It doesn't, but at least your child will always know that you were present.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, I can't really add anything to that. That was a nice wrap up.
So really,
Mm.
to wrap up the episode, I just want to emphasize the importance of that empathy building in order to create and establish a healthy relationship with your child, and not just with your child, but your child with their peers as well, helping them understand self-care and realizing when they are spreading themselves too thin, as well as being able to understand when it's appropriate to establish boundaries and teaching them that it's okay to establish boundaries. Like if something is pushing on them too hard and they're being overexerted emotionally, it's okay to say, I need a break. This is too much. I can't handle listening to you talk about your puppy anymore. I mean, we'll give them the words, right? We'll give them the words to say that appropriately or whatever they need to get that message across. But child first and foremost needs to feel safe that they're allowed to do that. And that's how we teach them self-care. That's how we teach them self-worth. That I think is the first step in helping encourage our kids to express when they need a break from emotionally intense situations.
Well said, Leah. Well said. That was awesome.
So,
Uh,
thanks for tuning into this episode on hyper empathy. Before we go, I'd love to hear from you guys. Have you noticed any signs of hyper empathy in your child? If so, what strategies have you used that have helped them manage these intense emotions? Or if there's a good example that you can share with us, please share them and join the conversation by joining the Embracing Autism community, or you can leave us a comment on YouTube and Facebook at Autism Wish. We will comment back. We respond to every comment essentially. Also, don't forget to become a member today and connect with other parents and access exclusive resources while continuing this journey with us. Until next time, everyone, take care.
have a good one. Bye.
Bye.